let people take their seats. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming to join us for our seminar on the future of work and social protection. The IMF has been more and more taking social protection into account in the work we do and in the advice we give and in the programs that we are helping countries to design. But we do this against a backdrop of changes in the future of work. And today, I think this topic is extremely important because of the way in which the future of work is changing. It's presenting opportunities, but I think it's also going to be changing the nature of social protection. We're seeing new technologies transforming the way work is done. Artificial intelligence, machine learning are going to be accelerating that process. The World Economic Forum says that AI and machine learning and mechanization may eliminate 75 million jobs, but they say it will create another 133 million. Whether that's true or not, I think we can agree that we're likely to see big changes in where people work, how they work. Can you hear me? That will in turn, I think, pose very, very great challenges for government and for the private sector. Many of us no longer work for the same employer in our whole career. Many in the younger generation are employed in the gig economy, and that's increasingly the case, and more broadly around the world. These changes obviously have an upside, but I think they have important downsides, which are subjects we need to talk about. We see changes in employment trends and unemployment trends since the global financial crisis. Many, many people lost jobs and have had to find ways to be reabsorbed into the labor force and have sought protection across that process. As I mentioned, many people are in the gig economy, predominantly in advanced economies. In developing economies, both low-income countries and emerging market countries, we see high levels of labor informality. We see wages growing, but still at low levels. We see job insecurity, and of course, important fractions of the population still in poverty. And so the challenges there remain substantial. And we at the fund are paying much more attention to the women's role in the economy. And clearly the women's role in the workplace is improving, but is still not equal to that of men. And that really is true both in developing and developed economies. Now the question I hope we can delve into today, and something where the IMF really wants to be listening and learning, is on the implications of all of these changes in the future of work for social protection, whether it's in dealing with labor informality or shorter spells of employment, dealing with migration, dealing with the many ways in which the workforce is changing. We'd like to talk about how best to respond. We have an excellent panel of people to take up these topics today. Let me introduce them to you, although I'm sure you know most of them. Your furthest right is Michael Rutkowski. He's the Senior Director at the World Bank, responsible for social protection and jobs. Sitting next to Michael is Nicholas Barr, Professor of Public Economics at the London School of Economics. Nick has written on welfare economics and public policy and has been advising governments on pension reform, higher education finances, and other policy issues. Next on Nick's right is Nora Lustig, the Samuel Z. Stone Professor of Latin American Economics at Tulane University. She's also the director of the Commitment to Equity Institute and a fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington. Finally, by my side is Sharon Burrows, the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. The ITUC is an active member of the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors. So thank you to all of you for joining us, and let's proceed. Let me begin first, if I might, with Nicholas. Nicholas, social protection has long been established in advanced economies. It was designed mainly in a context in which people had lifetime employment in a single place and perhaps from time to time faced layoffs and rehiring, and it was designed to deal with that kind of transition. Now we see, as I said in my introductory comments, a very different workplace. I wondered if you had thoughts on the ways in which advanced economies should be thinking about adjusting to the changing realities.
Well, as we've already heard, there's changes to labor markets, there's changes to families, there's changes to skills. I mean, the world that has gone had stable nuclear families, people got married and stayed married, the division of labor was gendered, work was full-time and long-term, skills once acquired were lifelong, and one has only to describe that world to see how much the world has changed. Today, families, more marriages end in divorce, families break up and reconstitute, parenthood is less tied to marriage, work, the labor market has become much more diverse in the relations people have with the labor market, and they change those relations much more frequently than in the past. Skills, skill-biased technical change means we need more highly skilled workers, greater diversity of skills, but, complicating the problem, skills have a shorter shelf life than they used to. So those changes have a series of implications. The first one is it's a more complex matching problem in labor markets. Labor market relations are more diverse, skills are more varied and shorter lived, modes of acquiring skills are more varied. So what you've got is a multidimensional problem of matching the preferences and constraints of individual workers with those of firms. I've stuck in my notes slightly frivolously. It's a bit like a dating website. You're trying to do a complicated matching process. Second implication is that policy design should put less reliance on contributions related to a person's employment status. When someone was employed full-time and long-term, you could base contributions on employment. That is less true today. So things like non-contributory pensions are helpful, healthcare financed not by a tax on wages, but from some other source. Third implication, greater, though not complete, reliance on individual entitlements. People have individual working records, women have individual working records. Thus, for example, you need women to have pensions in their own right, supported by childcare and pension credits. Fourth implication, greater emphasis on skills training. We need more skills, delivery of more education and training. It needs to be more diverse. It needs to be more frequent. And that means it needs to be financed. And schools should be financed from general taxation. Tertiary education, where institutional capacity allows, should be financed from a mixture of taxation and well-designed student loans. Final implication, advances in economic theory have taught some valuable lessons. One is the need for a more thoughtful approach to actuarial insurance. Those are lessons from the economics of information. We know that the model of private actuarial insurance doesn't fit important risks very well for technical reasons, healthcare being an example. And a second lesson from economic theory is a more thoughtful approach to individual choice. Simple theory says the more choice, the better. What we learn from behavioral economics is that limiting people's choice can reduce welfare. So you've got big changes and a whole series of policy implications that follow from them.
Thank you very much. Michael, let's turn then to developing economies. Developing economies really have never tried to have the breadth of social protection coverage that advanced economies have had, and there are gaps in that coverage. What's the right model? I think in years gone by, many countries were given the advice to copy things from advanced economies, but now that we see the changing nature of work and the special features of developing economies, how do you suggest that we think about the development of appropriate social protection mechanisms in developing countries?
Copying things after developed economies is less and less relevant nowadays than it was in the past. I doubt it was ever relevant, but we, for many, many years, lived in a dream. And the dream was that what we now observe as an informal sector will get formalized and will be replicating the social protection solutions known in the developed world across the world. That hasn't happened, and the economies that were 90% informal 50 years ago are 90% informal now, and it is, I think, high time to draw a lesson from that. A lesson is a twofold lesson. There is something which you need to do more of, and there are at least three things which really need to change to fill the social protection gap in developing countries. What we need to do more of are cash transfers, social safety nets, social assistance programs. They are widespread. More than 110 countries have something. But when you look at the bottom quintile of the population, only less than 20% of people in that bottom quintile during their lifetimes have any experience whatsoever with cash transfers or any form of social safety net, big in kind or cash. That needs to expand, and this is the best and most effective way of helping the poorest and most vulnerable in developing world. The transfers could be conditional or unconditional. We shouldn't overestimate conditionality. It's not that important. We know that unconditional transfers work as well. But there are at least three things which need to be done very differently. First, it is extremely important to shift the mindset and stop thinking about social protection being really dependent on the formal employment status, because that formal employment status is not arriving in the developing world and is decreasingly the case in developed world with a gig economy, what was said at the beginning. The second thing is that we live in the myth that payroll taxation is the most effective way of financing social protection, and there is the whole ideology behind about collective employers and employees' responsibility for that, the social insurance aspect that points to payroll taxes being the best financing mechanism. It isn't. It is a distortive mechanism. It acts against workers. Instead, we need to shift social protection to the broadest possible tax base. And this is especially important with current developments in the nature of work. The third thing, also extremely important, is about social insurance. I did say that less than 20% in the bottom quintile worldwide are covered by social assistance. But when you think of social insurance, it's not less than 20%, it's less than 3%. Basically, people in the informal sectors, those who do not have formal sector employment, have no ways whatsoever to cover their lifetime risks, to cover risks of disability, risks of old age poverty. But we observe technological developments as well as developments in behavioral economics that opens up these doors slowly, but hopefully surely. We see possibilities of a good identification of informal sector workers through ID4D, identification for development, such as an Aadhaar system in India. We see possibilities of using nudging, using auto-enrollment to start covering informal sector workers with some type of health insurance and then social insurance. The schemes like Pinbox in India, like MTN Mobile in Ghana or Arch in Benin are small ones, but they show that even in the informal sector workers, you could introduce risk management mechanisms that help those who truly are left out because they not only do not have an access to formal jobs, but most likely will never have this access. So we need to change the framing of thinking about social protection, and I think that would offer a hope of having a new paradigm of coverage in the informal sector worldwide.
Thank you, Michael. Sharon, I mentioned in the opening how technology is changing. There's more labor mobility, and people in jobs that would not have been considered standard employment settings a generation ago. Maybe you could say a few words about how you see government, corporations, labor's response to supporting people, to supporting labor, providing social protection, and maybe add any reactions you have to what you've heard so far.
So first of all, if we're talking about the future of work, then there are two central questions. One is, are we still committed as from all stakeholders to full employment? Because that's a central question. And if we are, then we have to look to the quality of jobs, to decent work. Does all business have a social license to operate? Because right now, that's the critical ingredient. It's breaking down everywhere. So it isn't work that is changing. Yes, it's adapting to technology. Yes, there are new elements of work, but if you're in agriculture or construction or manufacturing or services, you're still doing work in sectors that we've had with us for a long time. The real question is, are businesses taking responsibility for employment practices because they actually have a social license to operate? They're registered, they pay tax where they earn it, they take responsibility for those dependent workers. And where workers aren't dependent, are we looking at what kind of social license, what kind of regulatory frame guarantees that cooperatives have security, that we are formalising work where in fact the social licence is abused? And the answer is both governments and too many employers are simply evading that responsibility for regulated labour markets. And it's at a time when we have global shifts that are enormous. The challenges are converging, the climate crisis, the loss of lives and livelihoods. Our people are on the front lines there, changing seasons, the devastation that is making our world increasingly uninsurable. The pace of technological change is different, but indeed technology, we've lived with it for generations now. And mostly, we've been able to incorporate it in the labour market with solid collective bargaining in developed economies at least, where we can upskill business, increase wages and so on. However, when business models break down, then it's actually the technology of things like platform businesses that are contributing to an increasingly informal sector. When professional sectors like journalism, for example, you can earn as little as €15 a day in Europe, because that's the bottom price of an article, then you've got to ask, what is it that we're doing wrong? And it is about the business model. So in that context, you also have the displacement of people. You raised it. We've got the highest level historically of displaced people, and yet they're mostly in the developed economies. You know, the crisis is not, despite all of the hype, in our developed economies, when only less than 20% of displaced people are actually knocking on the doors to be resettled, to have the right to safe haven and equal treatment. But the big frame for us is that the social contract is broken. We had a growth model, 2 world wars, a Great Depression, that actually built much of the international multilateralism around the social contract. That has broken down and we need a new one. Consequently, we have a global workforce in trouble, and you can't separate it. You have informal work, but that's because people can't get formal jobs. You have organisations in our midst. I mean, I heard someone say today unions don't represent the informal economy. Well, I can tell you we put on 27 million new members in just 4 years, and the overwhelming bulk of them are in the informal economy, and we need to look at formalising those businesses even as we do new forms of that are generated by new forms of technology, and increasingly businesses' lack of responsibility for workers. Consequently, we have a global labour force in trouble, 60% only in the formal sector, the bulk of them in precarious, unsafe, low-paid work, the model of globalisation that people are pushing back about, that's threatening multilateralism, full stop. 40% in the informal economy and growing, as I said. Sector of desperation, no rights, no minimum wages, no social protection, and of course, no rule of law, essentially. And then women make up the bulk of the face of those workers who increasingly don't have those fundamentals of a new social contract. So yes, we need a new social contract, and social protection is the floor of that, has to be the floor. But I worry about people talking about social protection as an insurance model, when in fact the floor and the settlement around the global institutions just a few years ago was a social protection floor that was financed essentially from tax dollars. Yes, you might have to kickstart it with development aid in the poorest economies, but it's affordable. It's affordable, less than 6% of GDP. You marry that with essential public services and you have a basic economy that in itself generates jobs, that generates investment in the care economy where we can grow jobs for women and narrow that gap, David. So we need to think much more broadly. Despite our differences with the World Development Report, Michael, you know that we actually support you on a couple of things. We might argue about progressive taxation and what forms of taxation, and I might say to you, when some companies only pay payroll tax, why the hell would you want to take it off them? And if you come to my country, that's the truth. I don't live there at the moment, but I can tell you that we fought for state-based systems, much of Europe as well. It's not the American model where it's only tied to work. You have a basic pension, a universal basic income for those in need, not for everybody, but those in need, not in work. Pensions, disability protection, and so on, for essential public services. And then it was unions who bargained for the employment-related benefits that were above the floor. We'll keep doing that. But if people try to destroy the floor, then you get the desperation of today's economy. So social protection is critical. Universal basic income for everybody. Why? Why isn't it just for the most vulnerable? Why wouldn't you put extra money then into universal services, which is a very different environment? So we have a lot to talk about, but it comes back to, are we prepared to regulate for a social license for all business that formalises work and looks to the other areas of work? Should self-employed people have basic social protection from the tax system? Yes, they should. And of course, in that context, are we committed to full employment, and will that be generated, will that be governed by a new social contract and appropriate regulation?
Well, thank you very much. Nora, first, I wanted to give you the prize for the best physical advertisement. You see Nora's book up here, Commitment to Equity Handbook. Nora, Sharon mentioned quite a few different things, but touched upon the question of how tax revenues are going to cover needed social protection. And I wanted to probe the issue a little bit. I mean, we're seeing, and she mentioned also that the issue of displacement is more an issue in advanced economies where there have been more winners and losers than in EM countries where growth rates are strong enough that people who are displaced more quickly find new jobs. But in any case, whether it's in advanced economies...
I said it was the developed economies creating a crisis, if you like, because they're too selfish to look at resettlement and safe haven, and we see the xenophobia generated, whereas the real crisis is in the displacement and the flows of people in developing economies where there is no social protection.
The question that I wanted to pose, Nora, is with the fiscal constraints that we see in advanced economies, there may be an increasing reluctance to dedicate the resources to social protection that are warranted. And there may also be the need to prioritize, to think about what resources go to social protection, what resources go to other desirables, whether it's health, education, climate-related spending. I wonder if you have thoughts about how in this, the world we're likely to see in the coming years, how to be thinking about those choices.
Yes, okay, thank you very much. You're asking me about the developed countries, but I'm more an expert on the developing countries, so if you allow me, I will focus on those. And I mean, the book here actually is useful to answer that question. I can advertise it. I don't get any royalties because thanks to the generosity of the Gates Foundation, it's free online. So people can just download it without having to pay. And it fits good for the subject matter, which is commitment to equity. Everybody has access to it. I think that the issue about funding, funding the social protection floors in the developing world, I think it's very challenging, especially in low-income countries, because what we have found in the work that we do in the Commitment to Equity Institute, and by the way, we're now working with the IMF on actually assessing the fiscal systems in terms of what do they do regarding fiscal redistribution and poverty. What we have found is that in every case that we analyze, the fiscal system reduces inequality, but in a bunch of them, it increases poverty. They're two very different things, and people tend to mix them up. So they ask, how is that possible? Well, it is because poverty is about absolute levels and inequality is about relative. And you can have very, very progressive taxes that reduce inequality, but if the poor pay taxes and they're net payers into the system, they will be poorer after the net taxes that they pay. And we find that it happens in quite a few countries, especially the poorest ones, where we would not like to see that as an outcome, because if you believe that the poor have to be protected, I mean, you were saying they were getting very little in terms of cash transfers. Mm-hmm. So if to that you add the fact that in many cases they pay particularly consumption taxes, mm-hmm. It's not the direct taxes, they end up being net payers because it's not a decision that they make. When they purchase something, there is a tax embedded in what they purchase. Even if it's in the informal sector, that there's taxes in the inputs that people, of the things they buy in the formal sector. So in that context, I mean, I think it would be interesting to discuss the idea of universal basic income. What we find in some of the research that we're doing with some of your colleagues like Ugo Gentilini and Giamelli Rigolini, and also things that we've been doing for Africa, both with the IMF and the World Bank, is that it has a cost. If you go to a universal basic income, when you're in very constrained resources situations, you're giving up the ability to reduce poverty, because some of the resources will go to the non-poor, and if you try to collect more taxes to redistribute more, you may end up actually causing the poor to become poorer. So in that context, you have to be very careful about how you design the social protection floors and who's going to pay for those floors. It may not be possible to have the floors for, with a basic income that everybody would have access. I don't know if that's what you were proposing, or only when there is an adverse situation that people should have access. I'm asking. But if you have a universal one, no matter what, then you're going to be misusing very scarce resources if your objective is to help the very poor first. If you want to have also social protection schemes that replace income of people who have faced adverse shocks, in the developing world, that's very expensive, even in middle-income countries. Brazil has a system which is called special circumstances pensions, where people who have been exposed to death in the family, illness, or disability, they're entitled to receive something very similar to what they used to earn. This happens even if they're not, they have not contributed. It's a non-contributory system, but the beneficiaries are part of the Social Security system. They have a number. Okay? Brazil spends 2% of GDP on that, and it spends 0.4% on cash transfers for the poor. So if you want to have a system that protects and replaces income, then that's expensive. There are trade-offs. In the trade-offs, if you take them serious, I mean, if you want to have a lexicographic ordering in terms of where to start, I think that at least in my, if you want my Weltanschauung about this, you have to start by protecting the poor. And when you do that, probably you cannot commit globally to have a universal basic income in every country because, like I said, that means you're going to be taking resources that could be allocated to the poor and giving them to people who don't need them. So let me stop here.
Thank you. Michael, let me follow up on, or ask you to follow up a bit on that. I mean, you advocated before cash transfer approaches. You know, we certainly look at this question of cash transfers and that are targeted, universal basic incomes. But I guess I'm wondering how one draws some balance of priorities when one's also trying to promote good health systems, good education systems, so that the poor aren't just protected today, but they have opportunities over a longer time frame. And let me come back to the point that, you know, we're saying that the world may be one in which there's much more displacement coming from, whether it's coming from technology or trade or other factors. And then, it's not so much a matter of, well, I guess there's a question of whether you focus on helping people when they can't find a job, or whether you focus on helping people have a foundation to become engaged in the economy and to have better prospects of becoming engaged in the economy.
I very much agree with Nora's framing of the dilemma, which is that we need to start, I would suggest always start with thinking about the poorest. That's why the phrase we often use in the bank, it is used in the upcoming World Development Report 2019 on the changing nature of work, is progressive universalism, which essentially means to start with the poorest. And given that the ability to target well, for many reasons, including technological one, increases, and given scarce resources, it is upon us to do it in the first instance. However, given the fact that there is an increasing displacement and increasing turnover in the labor market, at the same time, a few other important principles come to mind. First is social protection, and cash transfers really need to follow an individual, not an employer, because of the dynamic labor market. This is why what we often try to say, but I believe sometimes we are misunderstood, we are saying flexible labor markets are not enemies of good social protection systems. They are friends. You need both so that innovation wins over automation in what's happening in the labor market. Essentially, you can frame the current situation as automation displacing old jobs and innovation coming up with new jobs with higher productivity. For that transition to happen, you need to have a flexible labor market, because new jobs appear in sectors you didn't even know they existed, but at the same time, those people in the transition period, as well as when they are poor, need to be protected, and it cannot be a protection that is dependent on the employer. And progressive universalism means we start with them, we expand, and for some countries, universal basic income may be the right solution. In my view, it is unlikely it will be a viable solution in the near future. It's more a matter of a much more distant future. I think the second important issue in this context is that yes, there is a trade-off between going with basic package of social assistance and health protection, which is absolutely should be a priority. This is why thinking of social insurance for informal sector workers, what I mentioned at the beginning, is viable only if additional resources are brought to the table. If there is a possibility of actually encouraging through nudging and auto-enrollment of informal sector workers to contribute. There is no way to impose a mandate here, and once you impose a mandate, then obviously it's akin to taxation, then the trade-off is very acute. We would like to go beyond this trade-off. The final point I wanted to make, and it seems to me it is really an important point, and I very much like this point being made before in the panel, which is that too often we look at either the taxation side or the benefit side alone and try to determine whether it's progressive or regressive. Whereas what really makes sense is to look at packages together. You could have regressive taxation, but more than offset by progressive, well-targeted system, and then the whole package is progressive. We do need more progressive packages. We do need, in the name of progressive universalism, to focus on the poorest first and then expand from this. And that should be, I think, a principle which should be with us in this journey.
It's an interesting challenge that you ask the 1% to pay much less, and indeed on regressive taxation, working people who, by your own account, can't actually make ends meet, pay more relative to their income. Let's not have that debate today, but we should keep that in mind. The reality is, though, the bit I do agree about is that you have to look at what the system is. I don't agree that cash transfers alone, and the banks had a policy where it's a bit schizophrenic, where they don't want to think about the integrated social protection floor as a whole. It's moving, but there is an argument for where there is nothing to have a universal basic income. It's been tested. Communities like India, small groups, and when it's in fact married with a jobs guarantee scheme with appropriate income, then in fact you can get a basic economy, security, and jobs grow. But but working people pay taxes. Why? To have social protection and vital public services. They don't pay taxes for all sorts of schemes at the base level. I mean, I know we negotiate incentives for business and jobs often, but at its base, you pay taxes for social protection and indeed vital public service. I know in the US that's not the case, but in my country, the unions fought for Medicare. In Europe, we fought for healthcare. We see it as part of deferred wages and the mix with the taxation we pay. So we really resent when people start to talk about this as if this is new. Let's look at the tax base. Let's look at what it's going to. What's the integrated solutions? And health and education, childcare, aged care aren't separate from a continuum of social protection, income where it's needed for those that don't have it, child protection, maternity protection, health, and of course education as well. But also let's look at the question then of what else you need for an economy that can work. What do we do to repair the broken model? Well, yes, it's decent work, it's a job, it's underpinned by social protection, but those jobs to meet the test of decent work have to be able to be afforded a minimum living wage. And then for prosperity, you need collective bargaining to distribute and keep the economy strong. And we've seen fights against what were fundamental human rights. 70th anniversary, the UN Declaration, by both the IMF and the Fund, and we have to get over them. How do working people represent with governments the responsibility and with employers to build a new social contract, to return to the fundamental rights that make it work, and invest our own collective wealth, i.e. taxation, into people? It's that simple.
Yes, but in order to do that, we really need to have our eyes open to trade-offs. If you say decent work, then we need to remember that when you look at the access to jobs, quality of jobs, quantity of jobs, you can get two but not all the three with fiscal constraints.
No, I don't
so
agree.
trade-offs are all over the place.
Yeah.
You have access and quality but not quantity, access and quantity but not quality, quantity and quality, but then you don't have access. As long as we are not discussing the very fine trade-offs, well, we are not doing a service to provide the framework for good jobs.
Not at all. You and I would agree on full employment. That's access. You don't want your children in work that is paid an amount of money on which you can't live. So that's quality along with safety and security and so on. That's fundamental rights, the ILO standards. And then, of course, I heard you this morning say decent work had a moralistic imperative. Well, I might remind you that the G20, the UN, the people who govern these institutions actually have committed to decent work. It's not moralistic. It's actually about, do you have a rights base? Do you have a minimum living wage? Do you have collective bargaining rights? And is there full employment as a guarantee? The answer should be, if not, we have to build it. So putting silos between these things talking about insiders and outsiders when there's not enough work for everybody and that the work is not decent because of a global model of development that has failed working people and is now at a root of stagnating growth, that's what we have to look at, not pit workers against each other. We represent all workers, and I can tell you it breaks my heart to see that informal work and modern slavery now appearing in our supply chains of the biggest corporations. Why? Regulations broken down. So it also breaks my heart to see that we're not looking at where we invest in full employment in developing economies as well as developed economies. So we have work to do, should be joint work, but we have to stop pitting each other against, worker against worker.
But I don't think it's pitting each other against. I think recognizing objective trade-off. As long as we don't recognize them, we can be helpful in words, but not in reality. And we do need to be helpful in reality for the same objectives you share and described.
One final comment. Why would the bank want qualified teachers for their own children, but in developing economies, teachers who are not qualified, given a tablet, absolutely some sort of fundamental futuristic look at education, when in fact we should say what we want for our children, we want for everybody. There's enough wealth in the world. Let's stop treating people differently.
We want the best teachers for everybody, and as you know, during these annual meetings, we are launching a human development project, of which one of the critical issues is recognizing a huge learning crisis worldwide. We are using the education indicator, which is weighted by the quality of learning, which is extremely poor in many countries. And this is a variable that has a major impact on the human capital index, which we will be publishing tomorrow. This is on the top of our agenda, is the quality of teachers so that we deliver on human capital so that the productivity goes up. So we are totally with you
everywhere,
on that.
Everywhere.
Yes.
But I mean, I'm sorry, I don't understand. May I ask something?
Please, Nick.
Yeah, I don't think there is a discussion about the objectives and the goals. I mean, I think here we all share them. Not everybody outside this room may share them, but here we all share them. The point is, how do we get there? No? And I think that's where we're having a little bit of a difference in opinion, because we can state what we want, but how would you get to that point by convincing who has to pay for it? That would be a question. I mean, who's not paying today for us to be in the ideal world that we should get to pay? Or is it that even if we want all the people that need to pay, we still wouldn't have enough to cover at this point what is needed? I think that's where the differences in the points of view here.
But I mean, this comes back to Michal's point about trade-offs, and I think that there are too many false dichotomies. I mean, there is a floor and there is income-related benefits. One needs both. Of course one needs a floor. One needs income-related benefits. The relative weights that you give to them will depend on the country. In poorer countries, the floor is much more important than earnings-related benefits, different in richer countries. Several people have talked about decoupling finance from employment status. A couple of examples. One, the Netherlands has a non-contributory basic pension. It is financed by something called the old age tax. It is a tax on income. It is paid by everybody up to age 65. But to get your non-contributory pension, you don't have to pay the income tax.
Exactly.
And one other example on income-related benefits, we've heard about auto-enrollment, an idea that intrigues me greatly that has become technologically possible. There is an experiment in Mexico, possibly elsewhere, where contributions are related not to income but to consumption. If I am in this program, I go into the supermarket, and when I use my card to pay for my bill, 1% of it goes to my pension fund, or 3% of my alcohol consumption goes to my pension fund. So there are technological ways of collecting revenues that don't depend on employment, which can finance both floor-type benefits, non-contributory pensions, child benefit being two examples that seem to me to be very clear paths to follow. How you deal with a universal floor for people of working age is more complicated. Nora has rightly said there are financing issues. But no forced dichotomies, please.
Thank you. Nicholas, could I ask you to say a few words on education? And you know, I think there are going to be very difficult decisions, especially in developing countries, say about how to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. There'll be a need for more domestic resource mobilization. There'll be a need for more support from the rest of the world. You know, we're working with countries to have better social protection, but we also have to think about the longer term question of whether children today will grow up having had a decent education.
I think in that context, two things come to mind. One is that for years, I think collectively, all of us, that includes IMF, the bank, we paid a lot of attention to the years of work of school, and the huge expansion of education in schooling is a result of that. But that came in the world of trade-off at the expense of looking at the quality, and the quality is dismal, and the last year World Development Report on the crisis of learning emphasizes it. And this is why we are having all those discussions, what constitutes a good teacher, how this good teacher should be financed, is the private sector in the mix or should not be in the mix. These are all extremely important discussions. I would like, however, to point out to one more thing on education or on skills, which is highly relevant in the context of the changing nature of work and the future of work, which is that what we are observing those days is an increasing importance of learning at work. In fact, Paul Romer, who just got a Nobel Prize when he was with the World Bank as a chief economist, he was talking a lot about returns to work and about work being school. And it's a non-trivial point, because with the fast technological change, the changing nature of work means that the acquisition and then depletion of skills cycles are faster than they used to be before. Therefore, in the human capital of average individual, increasingly so, the human capital acquired at work has a higher share than it used to have. It is increasingly important compared to what happens at school. And looking through those lenses at the labor market gives an additional insight. One of the additional insights, and I think Sharon referred to that, is actually the quality of jobs. Because the research shows, it is partial, it's not complete, it shows that poor jobs do not provide learning at the level of good jobs. Good jobs are actually a good school. Poor jobs is a bad school. Given the cycles, this actually matters not only at the moment of when those skills are acquired, but in the future, how those skills are used. And this is something which I believe we will be looking much more deliberately in the coming years, which is learning at work, the role of good jobs, not because they are decent, yes, but also because that they provide, there are an investment in the future skills in the labor market. And I think this is something we are starting to discover studying the changing nature of work and how the social protection system being put in place in the context of flexible labor markets can actually facilitate people transition from not so good jobs to good jobs, not that only that they have a higher income, but they actually learn more on jobs, and that helps in the future. Those cycles is something which I believe we'll be talking much more in coming years.
Let me put those points into a broader context, which is, as the changes I mentioned earlier mean we need more education and training, more diverse and more frequent. Several implications. First of all, you need flexible options and pathways. You need flexible choices over subject, methods of learning and teaching, the speed at which people acquire skills, and you need flexible pathways over the mix of the bits of the education and training system that people get their skills from, the time path, and, as Michael has just said, modes of delivery, which can be formal education institutions, could be learning at work. So the sort of thing I have in mind in a developed country context is it ought to be possible for someone to get a plumbing qualification, for example, and then build that into a degree by then or later adding adding units on business studies or accounting, or for that matter, anything else. And I've heard this referred to as stackable credentials, and I think stackable credentials can be acquired both in formal education and training and on the job. The third implication is a system of finance to support those flexible options, and Michael has said, and I've mentioned, you need taxpayer support. You may well need a system of student loans as well. Final and fourth point, very important one, emphasize early child development. There is this huge body of literature showing just how important early child development is. The English evidence, just as a teaser, is an English baby born in August will do less well in school than one born in September, and that effect lasts right the way through to university education. And I'm happy to explain that if anybody wants to ask me the question. The point is, what happens early on is enormously important, so one has to focus on that.
So, can I say two things? Oh, sorry, go on.
Yes.
Nora, then
Yeah,
Sharon.
but I mean, going back to your question, social protection versus education, and given what you just said, unfortunately, there is a trade-off. Unfortunately, there is a trade-off. I hate it, but there is it. There is one when you're in the poorest countries. Suppose, they collect about 20-25% of GDP in the form of taxes. In some countries, even some countries that even are equal, relatively speaking, like Ethiopia, so it's not that you can go and tax the 1% and get a lot out of it. They're poor and relatively equal. You have a trade-off. If you try to expand education and invest more there and even improve the quality, you may have to make the poor net payers, even more so than what they are right now. So there's a trade-off in the sense that you have to choose sometimes between saying, am I okay with the poor having less cash in their pocket to buy food and shelter and clothing, but I'm using that to give them better levels of education? And then, that brings your concern about early childhood.
Yeah.
A child that doesn't get enough nutrition when it's a child,
Absolutely.
then having more education is not going to result in anything in the future. So that trade-off is horrible, but it's there. So I think that resources, frankly, have to come from somewhere else. In some cases, they're not going to be able to be collected in the countries.
Yeah.
But
in that context, I just wanted to give one example when we try to deal with those trade-offs. And this is one, the typical context are conditional cash transfers, when you would like to actually increase the take-up of education services through encouraging families to send kids to school. And then there is a new area which is even without conditions, with proper information sharing and nudging, it is possible to achieve that. So the trade-off is out there, but in social protection programs, we increasingly try to build mechanisms that would reduce how acute the trade-off is and allow to increase the take-up of education services. It's
Michael,
obviously a very partial way of dealing with that.
Let me take moderator's prerogative to probe this a little further. I mean, typically, the fund will be working in a country and will be supporting a program of reform. And the country will want to, having talked to the World Bank, put in place a cash transfer system, especially, say, after a reform that they know is going to hurt the most vulnerable. And we have to have a discussion with them about should 20, 30, 40% of the population get this cash transfer amount. We know at the same time that while education spending may be inefficient, there is a need for education spending as well. And so it seems like a quite live issue how you make such a choice. And typically, countries favor very large fractions of the population getting the cash transfer mechanism, and that ends up having, at least implicitly, an implication with respect to whether those, I think there are imperfections in cash transfer systems in identifying properly who should be the recipients. I get all of that. But if you go from, say, 20% of the population to 40, you are, in some cases, dealing with people who are somewhat less needy, and you're using funds that might have been dedicated to some other purpose. It seems like it's a genuinely important question.
What makes it even more complicated is that the policy choices need to be dependent on the delivery mechanisms and how effective they are. You referred, David, rightly so, to targeting, how perfect or imperfect, how imperfect it is. But even if the targeting is good, but delivery systems don't exist, cash or in-kind benefits does not arrive on time, and if it arrives, you cannot monitor conditions associated with this benefit, like attendance at school or health checkups. That in itself needs to have a feedback mechanism to what policy you put in place. Too often, I think, we forget about the fact that the choices of policy are determined not only by economic efficiency or social justice, but what is actually possible to deliver. And the constraints are huge in developing countries and very diverse from countries to countries. If a country has a great social registry, this is a very different world than if a country doesn't have a social registry, has only birth registry, and therefore you can only vaguely talk about good targeting. But even if you target well, but then the country has isolated pockets when you cannot deliver the benefits, you'd better think of a different system that would rely on delivery mechanisms that are strongly contingent upon good geography. So what we are trying to do in recent years, and in a way in recognition of the fact that us working together with you, with the fund, and the fact that when there is a fund program, we would like to be the most effective in putting a good, well-targeted social protection system in place and assess trade-offs between education and social protection, how much the actually delivery systems come into play, and not only whether you can deliver the policy, but they are so important that you need to have a feedback loop and think in the first place whether the policy which would be ideal is even even could be considered. And I think this is a very important lesson from those programs that did not deliver despite good policy designs.
Thank you. Sharon, sorry I interrupted. Please.
No, I'm shocked to hear people talking about trade-offs. If you have a national development plan, and we have settled policy agreements by all of the leaders of the world, from the UN to the richer countries in terms of development and so on, then if you work out what the national development plan is, then you look at how you fund it, and that's the SDGs. Let's have a question about this, because, you know, if you're going to see where the funding comes from the SDGs, you can't say we're going to do SDG 4, education, or SDG 3, health, and then when we can afford it, we'll make people more educated or more healthy. You have to have a national development plan. And I'm delighted to see the progress that's been made by the IMF in its social protection review. But we have a way to go to get, first of all, the floor of development, the SDGs, correct. And where you get the funding from is dependent on what the country can afford and what it might have to do itself. If you go back to one simple equation in a country that was, it's not going to be the whole package, but that was mentioned, we found the lowest minimum wage in anywhere I've been in Ethiopia. And it was a woman working for one of the richest companies in Europe. And when we showed the evidence to the Prime Minister, then they have now negotiated with the unions a minimum wage process. That will in itself deliver greater tax revenue and more capacity to fund fundamentals such as the social protection floor and indeed public service. It won't fill the gap in a poor country like Ethiopia for everything immediately, but if you then have the funding across the SDGs, you get to sustainability within 10 to 15 years. Yeah. So what we are sick of is the silos. And on the final question of child development, everybody agrees it should be part of the plan. You know, I'm shocked to see that with crazy politics in Brazil, child mortality is going up again. I was just there a few weeks ago. That's totally avoidable. But if you go to the question of lifelong learning, again, why are we talking about this as if it's new? It's been around in my history. I was a teacher. I was on the Australian Skills Council till I left in 2010 with employers. And we used to actually negotiate both the question of what the skills were that required and what the shared commitments to financing were. Now, in that context, you're right. The government will have to make some contribution, but I'm shocked to see that the structured training commitment of major corporations, again, the breakdown in the model, stops here and it's shrunk here. And then you have firms arguing about mobility when the skills down through the supply chains are non-existent. We can all do better than that. Just as firms say, what's the R&D we need? What's the skills we need? And yes, lifelong learning, whatever name you put on it, is fundamental, but it's not new. It does need to be beefed up in the context of rapidly changing technology. But again, what we say is, across all of these convergence of global shifts and challenges, a national development plan, a new social contract that governs it with social protection at its heart. When you know what you need to do, then we have to negotiate who finances what.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the audience for questions in a second, but Sharon, I think that I'm intrigued by the point that you've mentioned and others have commented on about the role that corporations can play, especially in education. I think that there's a lot of untrodden ground there. But I wanted to come back to the SDGs. You know, for us at the fund, and now I'm going to do an advertisement. For us at the fund, we have to look at the difference between the plan and the reality. And so we've just done a study that was unveiled at the time of the UN General Assembly in September in New York, where we looked in detail at 6 countries, picked a subset of the SDGs that we thought we could, where quantification was possible. They were in the areas of health, education, and infrastructure. And we asked the question, are the countries on track to achieve the SDGs? And meaning with their present policies and with the tax base that they have. And not surprisingly, they're not. But I think what was surprising was the scale, the size of the differential. We showed that they will need not only massive, really ambitious domestic resource mobilization to raise revenues to GDP by as much as 6 percentage points, but they'll also need very substantial support from the rest of the world in the form of concessional finance. And you know, by scaling, making rough assumptions, we come to an estimate that $502 billion will be needed per year in order to help the poor countries attain these goals. Now, that's a huge number, but it is, after all, only 0.3% of global GDP. So it's something that if the countries of the world wanted to help, they could. But I mention all of this to say that the SDGs, need to be more than conceptual goals. There needs to be a connection between the means and the attainment of the goals. And if the funding falls short, then hard choices have to be made. And we often, as an institution, called upon to help countries make choices, get involved in the question of what scarce resources get spent on. In any case, we now have about 15 minutes for some questions from the floor. If people would like to, is that correct? I'm told I had till 3:15, 10 minutes. If people would like to ask a question, please come up to the microphone. Do me the favor of identifying yourself and then asking a question. Yes, please. Maybe grab that microphone out of there, yeah, so you can reach it. Very good. Can someone help her get that turned on? I think it's not yet turned on.
Taking my question. My name's Grace from Indonesia's news agency Antara TV. Government of Indonesia is trying to make some improvements in every aspect related to poverty alleviation and inequality. So like through social health insurance, family hope programs, subsidized rice for low-income households, and school aid program. My question is, how to improve social protection program in Indonesia? How can government ensure that social safety net programs reach their intended beneficiaries? Thank you, sir.
I'd be very happy to suggest that Indonesia expands PKH, The conditional cash transfer system, which is quickly on the way of becoming the largest in the world. It's still behind Bolsa Familia, but it is there. It is, in our assessment, well designed. The impact evaluation shows promising results, and there is a commitment to expanding it. And it is a program that, in addition to providing relief for the poor and vulnerable, also has good effects with respect to investment in early childhood education and in school education and in health. So from the perspective of everything we talked about the changing nature of work, I think that Indonesia has at its disposal a very important tool, which obviously, because of fiscal constraints, I think it is at the level at 8 million now, but has a potential to grow to be beyond 16. And this needs to be seized if the quality of the program remains at the current level.
We would say ask the people, because while there are some fundamental elements in place in Indonesia, the reality is that when you talk to the people, they'll tell you there are ways you could make health more affordable. There are more equitable ways of delivering education. And it's not a matter of massive amounts of extra money. On the minimum wage question, the government waxes lyrical about having increased the minimum wage, but it took the social partners out of the basket of goods surveys and elongated that to, I think it's once every 5 years, rather than a regular dialogue about what the needs of fundamental people are against evidence-based baskets of goods. So involve people, workers and their unions, but also people more broadly in the discussion about what will work. And then Indonesia might get back on track with a trust level, rather than what we're seeing is sadly the re-emergence of sanctions against organised labour and civil society because the voice of people is being suppressed.
It's right, one should ask the people, we can do better, we should do better, but you can't solve the problem by relaxing the constraints. If you try to do that, you harm the people you're trying to help. Economics is called the dismal science because of this thing called opportunity cost. If you use resources for one thing, you can't use them for another. If you want to do more with social protection, you need more resources. You should try to gather more resources, but you should be clear, A, that those resources come at the expense of something else, and B, there are incentive issues, and C, there are political issues. So pretending it's easy, I think, is not helpful.
We have another questioner over here in the left aisle, please.
I think this is on. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I'm Alex Catron. I'm with the Future Society, a think tank based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. You mentioned reskilling in AI at the beginning of the talk, and my question is, if you look at what the literature says about what the job market will look like in 20 years, it's sort of all over the map. There's predictions that new jobs will be created and sort of provide enough opportunity. But when you think about the actual equity of wealth, it's almost unequivocally the outcome is going to be that it's going to be stratospheric inequality. So is reskilling, does it distract from the bigger problem, which is the redistribution of wealth, which technology will do to drive away from economies that frankly don't have access to AI tools and supercomputers?
Sure. Wow. The skilling is important, but it is a distraction when people focus on it to the extent that it's a solvable issue. I can tell you about more educational reforms that would have made a difference littered at our feet because of political differences and a lack of trust in the teaching profession. Medical profession would probably say the same thing. But there's no doubt that skills are fundamental, that access to education is critical if we're going to have opportunities in life. But if you don't tackle distribution, and again, I'm going to say it, it's a relatively simple tool. It is social protection across the social protection floor. It is and that's a settled set of issues. It is, in fact, minimum wages on which people can live, evidence-based. And we can put regional floors of minimum wages in place, not the same level in every country, but takes wages out of competition. And at the same time, collective bargaining to distribute wealth more generally. In this country, collective bargaining hasn't grown at all in the last, under democracy really, because the constraints from the elites and the rich countries on a failed economic model internationally propped up, I'm sad to say, by failing multilateral institutions. And we all need to have strong multilateral institutions. But if you don't redistribute wealth, then, you know, you're right, you know, the panel's right, that the base of the wealth is not there. So Indonesia should be now one of the world-beating economies. It has everything. If you have a look at it, that should make it so. But you have to share wealth and you have to look at the economic model. Ironically, the last president, President Yudhoyono, in his last month said to me, in Jakarta, we realise that the low-wage model is over in Indonesia if we want to be a sustainable country for the future. Has that happened? No, we've seen wealth grow, inequality grow actually, and despite some of the measures that you've heard talked about, if you go back to the elements of wealth distribution, you look at your taxation model. And I was intrigued by David's comments because I looked at the study, but if you'd married that study against, let's assume the cost is right. I don't know, I didn't do the work and I haven't looked at the methodology, but let's make the assumption that the model is right. If it takes X amount of SDGs, money to implement the SDGs fully in those countries, then where is the elements of what the deficiencies in wealth are? And I can tell you that if you looked at fully implementing BEPS, the basic erosion and profit shifting tax agreement that again the world settled on at all levels, if you implemented it, there's billions of dollars from that flow. You know, if Jeff Bezos actually paid for wages for his workers or any other major corporation, in fact, Jeff Bezos alone could pay for 20% of that cost, given he's the first hectare billionaire, I think, and he said he had too much money to focus on the world's problems, he was going to invest it in space. I'm sorry, but some of these really high wealth individuals have to realise that they're eating up their own stability if they don't make a contribution. But I wanted to actually give you a good example because, you know, the unions have bargained for deferred wages everywhere to solve these problems in my history. You know, I've bargained up, we've bargained down, but in Denmark, just recently, the last national agreement, and Olivier Blanchard would like this because he thought these collective bargaining at the national level was good for managing some areas of crisis. They have actually just bargained, no government support, wealthy country of course, but bargained for a fund that actually will provide income for workers displaced by technological change, support skills development at the same time, and then redeployment support. And the average time out of work right now is 7 months for a Danish worker. Now, if you could figure out how we manage that in different ways with different levels of wealth, then no one would be frightened about the changing nature of work, and that's again a commitment by that country to full employment. If you have that, you have the systems and wealth is distributed to help pay for it, then you have a different world. And that's why multilateralism will fail if we don't look back to these fundamentals.
Thank you. One last question and then we'll have to wrap up, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Mohammed from Somalia. In the world, especially Africa and Middle East, are more increasing unemployment rate. Social protection are also denied. Trade unions are challenging high rate taxes. Labor unions are facing many challenges from international organizations and local authorities for dismissing and without life insurance. Vulnerable communities are increasing. My question is, what is the strategy or recommendations that World Bank and IMF have to reduce vulnerability and to recognize social protection?
Thank you very much.
Yes, I think what we need to do is to bring up to the level of policymakers and those who decide the importance of social protection, not only in terms of the immediate effects, but its potential in terms of increasing the capacity of human beings to be more resilient to changes. You are coming from a country which is in a very difficult situation, where you also have issues of the need to have social protection system inclusive with respect to large population movements, with respect to forced displacement, with respect to migration. And I think it is very important to be unified in understanding that of the universality, of the progressive universality, of the need to cover those that may be in need even though they weren't in need a moment ago. And this dynamism, the ability of social protection systems to adapt, is extremely important. We usually use this term adaptive social protection talking about climate change. It is obsolete. Since the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul, we have lots of work done with humanitarian agencies to bridge the gap between what is traditionally considered humanitarian and what is considered social protection systems building. That needs to be bridged. We need to have humanitarian systems that can actually transmit into social protection systems. We need to have systems of social safety net that can be immediately scaled up when any type of a disaster hits, be it man-made, be it natural, be it drought, be it a flood. And I think this adaptability is the name of the game with respect to your question.
Well, I'm told we really have to stop because some of the panelists have to proceed to another event. Let's take a moment and give a great round of applause for this wonderful panel on an important topic.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated while the delegation depart the auditory.
If we may get together for that. Yes.